For our 103 group project, we decided we were going to cover the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. On March 25, 1911, a fire broke out on the top floors of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, killing 146 people and injuring an additional 78 people. The building is located in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Manhattan, New York. This is our hand-drawn picture of the 9th floor of the building where most of the casualties occurred. As you can see, there's 3 sections of this floor designated for elevators and only one mean of escape, and it's the outdoor fire escape. The conditions on this floor were crammed, and there was no fire detectors or alarms. Moving on to the history of the incident. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a women's clothing manufacturer located in the Greenwich Village area of New York City. It became one of the deadliest fires in history when a fire broke out on the factory floor and resulted in the death of 146 workers. It had approximately 500 workers inside the facility that Saturday when the fire broke out. Most of these workers were immigrant women and teenage girls who would cut and sew the cotton garments and discard the scrap material into the bins below their workstations. These waste bins were rarely emptied and created an immense fire hazard. It was publicly declared that a cigarette butt or lit match was discarded into one of these bins, sparking a fire that rapidly spread across the waste bins. The entire 8th floor was engulfed in fire within 5 minutes of the fire's ignition, and the fire spread up through the building, threatening workers on the 8th through 10th floors. Panicked workers attempted to escape the building, but were left without adequate egress route, causing 146 people to perish from smoke inhalation, fire exposure, or jumping out of the windows trying to jump to safety. Moving on to building construction. The building was built in 1900 and stood 10 stories tall. The Shirtwaist Factory was located on the 8th through 10th floors of the Ash Building. When this building was constructed, it was known for its fireproof rooms. However, owners would typically lock the doors to try to prevent workers from going on breaks or even to the bathroom, including all safety exits, which is a huge code violation by today's standards. When the building caught fire, many workers jumped to their deaths or to serious injury. The building still stands today and is owned by New York University. The Ash Building was predominantly made from iron and steel. Workers were not allowed to smoke in the building. However, it was typical for them to sneak cigarettes through and smoke while they were on duty. Some say the fire started from a cigarette. However, there are some articles that claim arson looked like it could have been the cause, or a faulty sewing machine. Moving on to fire suppression and hazards. The Triangle Shirtwaist fire was a tragedy that could have been prevented. The factory was a sweatshop with multiple fire hazards, such as the discarded pieces of clothing in the bins. The building lacked proper maintenance and any type of code compliance. Here are some findings on fire suppression and life hazards in the building. You could see on this newspaper that it states women were cut off from exits and there was no outside fire escapes. According to one of the sources we used for research, someone on the 8th floor was able to notify someone on the 10th floor that there was a fire. However, the 9th floor wasn't aware of the fire until the fire itself had begun to engulf people on that floor. Fire suppression and safety hazards. Neglected safety measures and locked doors were the majority cause of deaths in this tragedy. Fabric littered the sewing floor, as said before, and there were months' worth of trimming scattered across the floor that had not been discarded as they should have. Smoking was allowed at workstations, however, it was frowned upon. Sewing tables occupied so much space that they became obstacles during escape attempt. 1 out of 4 elevators worked, but it only had 12 at a time. Only held 12 at a time. The elevator shaft was filled with bodies. There were 2 stairways. One's doors were locked from the outside. Both opened inward. Victims pinned the doors shut, preventing entry to firemen. There were no fire alarms, sprinklers, or fire extinguishers throughout the 8th through 10th floors. The hose line in the building was rotted out and the valve was rusted shut. The fire escape was weak and very narrow. It eventually collapsed under the weight, sending people plummeting to their deaths. Going back to where it talks about the hose line in the building being rotted out and the valve rusted shut, during a typical fire inspection or a valve inspection, you would make sure that those pieces of equipment were able to help fire suppression needs and meet code standards. Moving on to fireground operation. Firefighters tried using extension ladders in each corners of the building, but their ladders were too short and only reached 6 floors, and the fire was on the 8th through 10th floors. They tried catching people with fire nets, but they weren't strong enough. They weren't able to enter the building because the weight of the victims and the dead bodies covering the floor, window, and doors. They did defensive operation with the conditions they had and tried to reduce fire hitting other buildings in the area. Most entrances were collapsed or had dead bodies blocking the other side of the door. The fire took around 30 minutes to be extinguished, and some of the equipment inside the building were not up to date or maintained, causing some trained civilians failure when using that equipment, causing panic. What did we learn from this fire, and how does this fire still affect us today? This fire was huge for the growth of organized labor and labor unions. One of the biggest pieces of articles from this fire was the Don't Mourn, Organize magazine that was created with experts from the NFPA talking about what could have been changed within the building to help the victims inside. This tragedy brought to light many issues within the working class. Prior to the fire, there were very little laws to protect workers, but like many other tragedies, this fire brought about many code changes. This factory was constructed with mostly wood components, but also had steel and iron throughout the building. Because the code required 11-story buildings to be constructed with stone, this factory was only 10 stories. New York Committee of Safety was formed due to the nation's interest in this fire. Eventually, in 1913, the NFPA formed the Committee on Safety to Life, which specialized in worker safety, and in the case of a fire, how to ensure safety for the employees. The NFPA organization also brought to life the Life Safety Code, which there's a picture on this slide to the right. And from then, that committee was enlarged and eventually published the Building Exits Codes. Because of this fire, stricter enforcement of fire codes were brought along, and working conditions and protection laws for the working class were enacted. This fire was a tragedy, but also shaped a lot of the codes that we still use today, and some of the codes that we still enforce today. Thank you for listening to our presentation.